Hi, Jim. I am so thankful for part one. I know that it's made a big difference in our life groups, the discussions that people are having, and
Awesome.
they're doing it via Zoom, which like we are,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But last week we started with this idea of that our folks are like a jury, and you're a ex cold case detective officer, and you had to present a lot of cases to juries. You had to use documents and eyewitness reports from people that had already passed away, and you kind of looked at Jesus through the cold case detective lens.
That's right.
And so last week we talked about the concept of truth, that there is objective truth. Is there anything you'd like to review a little bit about on that?
Yeah, if you think about it, what I want to do this week, especially as we start, is like answer the bigger question. When we talk about objective versus subjective, we're simply just asking the question, does truth, and some truths are subjective in that you and I as subjects get to decide about our personal preferences. We like certain kinds of desserts. We like certain kinds of cars. And you get to decide those personal preferences because you as the subject make those decisions. But there are other truths that are really not a matter of personal opinion. They transcend personal opinion. So if I, said, oh, that car is white, that's not a matter of my personal opinion. I can't make the car green by saying, well, now in my mind, it's green. Well, okay, it still is going to look white to everybody else because that's an objective claim about the car, the object known as the car. So what's important to know the difference is that we have to ask the question, is God's existence really just a matter of personal opinion? So that there are people who would say he exists and they have a life that they enjoy under that assumption, and that's good for them. But if you don't think God exists, that's okay for you too, because it's really a matter of personal opinion. Or is the existence of God an objective claim about reality? It's called a metaphysical claim. It's a claim that's about the bigger issues about the nature of reality. And we talked about last week how God's existence, while it might be false that he doesn't exist, the claim that God exists is an objective claim that your opinion has no weight, you could say, in my opinion, he doesn't exist. Well, that's not going to prevent him from existing if he does. Or you could say, in my opinion, he does exist. That's not going to make him exist if he doesn't. He either exists or he doesn't, and that's an objective reality. So what we're going to do this week is try to do two things. Number one, if that's the nature of truth, how do we determine what is true? And number two, make a brief case. And I remember, this is from a book I wrote called God's Crime Scene, and I teach that class at Biola. It takes me 17 hours to teach what I'm going to show you in the next 20 minutes. Okay, so what we're going to do here is just tiptoe lightly across the mountain peaks of this discussion. Okay, and in reality, we're not going to be spending much time in the valleys, but that stuff's out there and it's available.
Yeah, and that it is. And you and I were talking about it. In El Fido, we have a lot of lakes. We skip rocks a lot, right? We're just skipping across the top of the water, as you said.
That's right.
And there are deep thinkers who have gone into every one of these subjects. We could go into this for, as you said, one class, 17 weeks. So
right.
I'm excited to we have Right Now Media as a church, and you're on there a lot. And I'm hoping every one of our kids that come from this church have parents who have their kids ready for the world when they go out into these secular colleges. And it matters a great deal to us that we have our people ready to be able to answer these questions, because they're going to be under attack. God's crime scene, is there a God? Isn't there a God? What kind of a God is he? Those claims are going to be under attack in the secular world all the time.
Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you something, and you have to be ready. Of course, if you invite a cold case detective to come and talk about God's existence, he's probably going to use some kind of gruesome death scene in order to make the case, okay? So I'm going to do that right now with you, okay? So let's just jump in and get started. What I want to do is show you and how I'm going to basically teach you to become a good death scene investigator. In essence, I always call this Death Scenes 101. So here we go. Death Investigations 101. You're going to walk into a room and you got a dead guy. Now, this dead guy looks a lot like my son, Jimmy, because he is my son, Jimmy. But the point is,
and he's not dead.
Yeah, and he's got Trader Joe's. You know, Trader Joe's is a great place to work, as you know. You got Trader Joe's up there. This is before he was a cop. Now, my point is, if I encountered this dead guy on the floor, I could easily ask the question, is this a murder? Not every dead guy is murdered. And there's 4 ways to die. Only one of them is a homicide. So we have to ask a question. There's some evidence here. So far, the only evidence I have is a dead guy laying face down. So we make a list of all the evidence on one side of the room, and then we make a list of all the ways to explain the evidence on the other side. So all we have so far as evidence goes is dead guy laying face down. Well, how do you explain dead guys laying face down? Well, sometimes people die naturally. Sometimes they die by way of some accident. Sometimes they commit suicide, and sometimes they are killed by others. It's a homicide. So what I'm trying to do in this investigation is cross out what is not reasonable, so that what's left is the most reasonable explanation for the evidence. We do this in every death scene. We ask jurors to do this as well. But right now, given what I have, what can I really cross out? Nothing. Because if he died of a heart attack, he would look like that. If he died by accidentally taking too many pills, he would look like that. If he died by taking too many pills intentionally, he would look like that. If I poisoned him with too many pills, he would look like that. So right now, I can't really cross out anything. So let's change the scenario. What if he's a dead guy laying face down, but he's in a pool of his own blood center torso? That pool is a new piece of evidence that we can add to our evidence list. And there it is. Now, what can I cross out? Well, look, anything is possible. We talked about this last week. I don't care about possible. I only care about reasonable. Where could he bleed out of center torso that's reasonable? I think I can cross out natural. That's not going to happen naturally. But really, until I roll him over, I can't determine what the cause is. I don't see the injury yet. So let's go back to our crime scene. We've ruled out one possible is not reasonable. So we've ruled out the natural death, but the other 3 are still in play. Let's change this. What if he's got a single gunshot wound to his back? There's a pistol and a casing on the floor. That is an exit wound in his back, an exit wound. Now I can add this to the list of evidences. There they are. What can I cross out? Let's see. I really still can't cross out anything more, because if he accidentally shot himself with a loaded gun that he thought was not loaded, that's what it would look like. And if somebody committed suicide by shooting themselves in the chest at a downward angle, that was what it would look like. And if somebody, I can't cross out anything still. So let's go back to our scene. Let's change it. What if, in addition to all of this, we have a note written on paper I find elsewhere in the room? It's a suicide note. It's written in his handwriting. It's got his pen. He's got the only fingerprints on the paper are his fingerprints. Well, now I can add this to my evidence list. I have a suicide note. I can at least cross out accidental death. I mean, he may have shot himself before he intended to shoot himself, but it looks like he intended to shoot himself from the note. But I will tell you, Jim, I have people who will say to me, I'm not sure it's a suicide, even though there's a suicide note there. They'll say, well, somebody could have forced him to write that suicide note. I get it. They all watch too much Criminal Minds, right? They all think they got these theories about how he might die. So let's go ahead and change our scenario a little bit. What if, in addition to all this, I had additional data, like what if they had multiple gunshot wounds to his back, not just one? And what if the wounds in his back were entry wounds? What if the paper sitting next to him was not his paper and not his pen, and it's not his handwriting? What if there were bloody footprints leading out of the room? Well, let's take a look at all that. We'll add all that right here. So now these are now not exit wounds, they're entry wounds. We've got unknown fingerprints on the note, and we've even got bloody footprints leading out of the room. Okay, well now when I go back to my list and I add that stuff to the list, it's really clear that it's kind of hard to shoot yourself multiple times in the back and then walk out of the room in your own blood. I think we can cross out suicide, and homicide is the most reasonable inference. By the way, this approach at discovering truth is called abductive reasoning. It is simply inferring to the most reasonable explanation based on evidence. We do it all the time. You do it 1,000 times a day without even realizing it. And jurors do this all the time. Now, what I also taught you is a little trick that I teach other investigators that's going to help us determine if God exists. Here's the trick. If you can explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room, it's probably not a murder. If you can explain everything that's in the room by staying, let me give it to you visually. Let's make him the room a box, a little box, and he's now in the box. We're going to play a game of inside or outside the room. If I find that there's a suicide note that is in the room that is written by him on paper I find elsewhere in the room, he's the only person whose fingerprints are on that. The only skin cell DNA transfer is his. Well, I can explain that by staying in the room. He's the one who was in the room. He wrote that while he was in the room. And if I can say, well, that gun, is that a gun? Well, it turns out, yeah, people say that's his gun. He's owned it for years. He keeps it in a safe in the room. And sure enough, it's registered to him. There's no evidence anybody else has touched the gun. I can now explain the gun by staying in the room for an explanation. It's his gun. And anyone can shoot themselves once without any help from anyone else outside the room. So now, if this was what it would look like, if I had one gunshot wound and no footprints and all these facts were still true, it's going to be one of these. It's not going to be a natural, clearly, but it's going to be an accidental or a suicide, because I can explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room. Let's shift it, though. What if the best explanation is outside the room? So, for example, it doesn't have his fingerprints. It's not his skin cell transfer. It's not his paper. It's not his handwriting. Now I got to figure out who did that. Who outside the room brought that into the room? And that gun, oh, it's not his. People say he's afraid of guns. He would never own a gun. And sure enough, it's not registered to him. And there's no evidence he's touched it. Now I got to figure out whose gun is that. It doesn't belong to him. And it's kind of hard to shoot yourself multiple times in the back. Better explanation is probably somebody else was involved in that. And I've got bloody footprints that lead outside the room. So think about that. This is now the best explanation is outside the room. Now I'm going to shift to the possibility of a homicide. Why? Because I have good evidence of an intruder. And intruders change everything. Intruders are what turn death scenes into crime scenes. Because I've got an intruder, I got to start looking at that possibility. And intruders are what turn that sense of curiosity you might have into a sense of urgency. Because the one show that gets it right is a show called The First 48. Right? The first 48 just talks about how you have to be urgent. In the first 48 hours, you got a better chance of actually solving the case. Now, why am I showing all this to you? I'm going to come back and join you in a second. Because the same approach could be taken with the universe. And this is how I approached it as an investigator. So instead of having a death scene in that box, what if that box was the entire natural universe? In other words, everything we see in the universe is made up of space, time, matter, impacted on by physics and chemistry. If I took the approach, can I explain everything that's in the physical universe by staying inside the room of space, time, and matter acted on by physics and chemistry? Or is the better explanation outside of space, time, and matter? And I think there are some things we got to explain. We have a universe that has a beginning. That box has a beginning. It wasn't always there. And that the question then becomes, if all space, time, and matter, according to the science, have a beginning, that means you're looking for a cause that is non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material. Do you realize that already we're outside the physical universe for the cause of the universe? Because we know the science tells us there was no space before space. There was nothing before space. What? Isn't space nothing? No. Space is something. Well, then what's nothing? Aristotle says rocks dream about nothing, okay? So whatever causes the universe to come into existence, it's not spatial, it's not temporal, it's not material. Also, the universe appears to be fine-tuned for the existence of people like you and me, carbon-based life. This appearance of fine-tuning is not controversial at all. Even people who are atheists think there's the appearance of fine-tuning. They just can't explain it. And life emerges from non-life in the universe. Inorganic material becomes organic biological structures that live and breathe. We have no idea. We've been looking at this for over 50 years. We're not even close to having an answer for this scientifically. And when it does appear, it appears to be designed for a purpose. And even the evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins, who's a very committed atheist, says that all of biology is the study of stuff that appears to have been designed for a purpose. Duh. But he denies there's a purpose giver or a designer. Also, you and I are thinking about this right now using our immaterial minds. Well, wait a minute. If all we have is a material universe, how do we account for immaterial minds? And by the way, this is a real mystery. It's called the problem of mind. And we have free agency because we have minds that we make choices. But think about it. If the universe is entirely physical, That means that it's called physicalism. It means that all you really have are dominoes that fall against other dominoes. Dominoes don't make choices for themselves. They just act upon once they're fallen upon. And that means that the people who are atheists, if they're consistent with their theory, and Sam Harris, who is an atheist, who's a neuroscientist, he's very consistent. He denies the existence of mind. He knows you can't get mind from a material universe. He also denies the existence of free agency, free will. Because he knows he says what's happening is you have a neuron that fires that causes the next neuron to fire, and you have no control over your neurons firing. That's just a physical process in your brain. You have brains, but not minds. And we recognize that there are objective, transcendent moral truths. Where do those come from? How do you get those from biology? Science can tell you what is, but science cannot tell you what ought to be. Yet we recognize there are lots of oughts. Where do the oughts come from? And we recognize a standard of righteousness that when it gets violated, we call these things objectively evil. Well, how can that be the case if all we really have is science? Again, science cannot tell you what ought to be. All science can tell you is what is. All right, so all of these things, if you ask me, are the very things that we have to decide. How do we explain these things inside the room? And that really becomes the trick, I think. And so let's just start right there. That to me is the challenge for all of us, right, Jim, is that we've got to figure out. And by the way, this burden of proof is equal to both of us. So let's say, for example, I've often heard it said that the burden of proof is on you, Mr. Theist, the guy who believes in God, Mr. Christian. You think there's a God that exists? I don't see God. If you're going to propose there's the flying spaghetti monster I can't see, then the burden of proof is on you to prove that it exists. That's not exactly how this works. If you and I went to a crime scene together and we looked over the yellow tape and I said, man, based on the evidence in that crime scene, I think her husband did it. And you said to me, no, man, I think her coworker did it. Okay, well, I have a burden of proof then to show you why I think the evidence demonstrates that the husband did it. And you have a burden of proof to show me why you think the evidence demonstrates the coworker did it. So here's what we're looking at, a universe in which these 8 features, they exist. We all have to acknowledge they exist. The only question is, how do we explain them? I have a burden of proof as a God believer to argue as for why I think God is the best explanation for those 8 things. But if you think you can get those with space, time, and matter, that obligation's on you to show me how you get that fine-tuning, how you get the appearance of design, how you get immaterial minds and free agency, how you get objective moral truths, if all you have is space, time, and matter. And I'll be honest, I held that position for 35 years. I argued with all 8 of those things. I was a Big Bang cosmologist. I believed all this stuff. But to be honest, those explanations really don't work. And once I started to realize they weren't, and by the way, they don't work and they know they don't work. And that's why you have multiple explanations for each of these questions on the side of atheists who are trying to explain them from just space, time, and matter. So that's something you got to keep in mind, is that the obligation is on both of us, not just on us as God believers. It's on the atheist who says, no, I don't need God. I can get that with physics. Okay. That burden's on you then to show me how you can do that.
Yeah, I think in my journey, it was, okay, I don't think there's a God, which means that you have to ask and answer the question. Obviously, there's something. How does something come from nothing?
Right.
Something doesn't come from nothing. Where did we come from? How did that work? Now, initially, there was this materialistic view, a closed system view that everything's inside the box.
Right.
And then you have to start going through, all right, how does it, and there are laws of science that these people who oftentimes say there's no objective truth say there is objective truth, right? Yes. There are laws of science, they would say, and you have to, there's laws of science such as the second law of thermodynamics. Energy doesn't go from a lower level of utility to a higher level of utility left to itself. Things wind down, and we see that. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Science says that there has to be empirical evidence, and we have to be able to see it. But many of the things they claim happened in the universe, we can't see anywhere actually happening.
Sure.
And so it's a faith statement.
Yeah, well, look, I would say, look, I would say it this way. I think that we have the same burden when we work cases in the past. Okay, that murder could have happened last week, and I'm not going to be able to conduct an experiment to enact the murder. But we use what we call forensic science to make claims and to investigate claims about events that occur in the past. So there's an aspect of forensic science that we could probably use to do this work as well. What you just said, for example, that's helpful. The second law of thermodynamics is very helpful. And I'll be honest, most people are like, most people are that's too much for me. How's that going to help me? Second law of what? I mean, I can see it. Look, I don't know about you, but when I think about having to go back and do some of my science, there's a collection of books here behind me here. So these are all the books that I kept after writing God's Crime Scene. I had to read 134 books from atheists who have claims about the universe. And I kept all that stuff just so I have as a reference. But I'll be honest with you, if I had to write that book again, I think I would decline. I don't want to, that was not easy, okay? And most of us don't want to talk about that kind of stuff. It's just hard to understand. But let me give it to you a simpler way. The claim is that the universe began to exist, and that is a problem for atheistic naturalism. Because if it began to exist, it means that it has to come from some cause. Is that an impersonal force? Well, here's the problem. Everything we think of as the universe, as natural world, is composed of space, time, and matter. But we're suggesting, and the science is demonstrating this, that universe did not exist forever in the past. And that means it had to come into existence from nothing. Because if there's space, you still have a universe. No, everything came into existence, space, time, and matter, from nothing. And that beginning point starts to sound an awful lot like Genesis 1. Everything from nothing. And the cause has to be a non-spatial, non-material, non-temporal cause that can also give you mind, free agency, objective moral laws, a standard of righteousness you can judge evil by, and is the designer behind the appearance of design. Do you see the problem here? The more you start to go through these scientific steps, the more this thing starts to shape out like the God that we understand. One way to get around that has been, well, I don't believe that the universe has a beginning. But look, that position is not, there are some people who hold or try to change the definition of a beginning or change the definition of nothing in order to try to get around this. Lawrence Krauss is an astrophysicist at Arizona State University. He tries to change the definition of nothing to get around the problem. That's not going to work, right? He'll say, well, look, if you have if you have a virtual environment or a quantum environment in which virtual particles pop into existence, and you wait long enough, you can get particles that'll pop into existence and grow into the size of universes. And then you have an infinite number of universes that came out of that quantum environment. Wait a minute. So you're saying, Lawrence, if I start with a spatial quantum environment, space, and then I have virtual particles pop into existence, energy and matter, and I wait long enough, time. So you're saying, Lawrence, if I start with space, time, and matter, I can get space, time, and matter? Yeah, no, duh. You just redefine what nothing is, so it makes this work for you. It doesn't work this way. And when you talked about the second law of thermodynamics, let's put it this way. How do we know? That's just one reason why we know the universe has a beginning. So for example, if you walk out of your church, the first day you get ready to open the doors again, and the first person who walks into the sanctuary sees a little wind-up toy police car is running around through the aisles. It's a wind-up toy. They're going to look at that and they're going to think, first thing they're going to think is, where's the winder? Because they know that thing, it must have been wound pretty recently, because it's winding down right in front of them. The fact that you have a toy that is slowly winding down says there was a time in the past, not too long ago, when that toy was tightly wound. And what we have is a universe that is winding down. The second law of thermodynamics tells us this. What that demonstrates to us is there's a point in the past in which it was tightly wound. The fact that we have the second law of thermodynamics showing us that useful energy in the universe is depleting, this thing we call entropy, demonstrates that we are in a universe that had a beginning. And there's lots more evidence I've talked about, and we're not going to even try to touch that today. But my point is, this is why this model that the universe came into existence from nothing, they call this Big Bang cosmology. And regardless of what your understanding of Big Bang is, this is called the standard cosmological model because the vast majority of cosmologists hold to that model. The science is actually making a case for Genesis 1, and they don't even realize, I think they realize it. And that's why you'll see that there are alternative theories that try to avoid the problem of a beginning. And that problem has been described that way, not by me. The problem of a beginning has been described by astrophysicists, because they know that the beginning presents a problem under atheism.
Well, and I just think about it this way. What they do is they sometimes accuse us of what's called the God of the gaps belief system.
Right.
When we can't answer a question, we just say, well, God did it, right? But I would accuse them. They don't have an answer. They have no answer for how something came from nothing.
Yes.
They have no answer for how consciousness comes into play. How even like back when Darwin was around and he's looking at the cell, he thinks it's some sort of minor, simple structure. Now neuroscience tells us that the complexity in DNA, the information, in the organization, and they go, well, we don't really have an answer for that, because they know that matter left to itself, it doesn't organize, it disorganizes.
That's right.
It winds
That's right.
down. So they go, well, science someday will prove to us or tell us what happened, because they can't say it's a God, even though there's design and consciousness and all those things. That's excluded. That's a presupposition they start with. There can't be a God. So somehow, someday, there's this God of science that somehow will fill in the gaps.
Yes.
And make it all make sense for them. We just
you're absolutely right about that. There's lots of things they cannot explain, but I want to show you something that I think will open up some eyes, just to kind of give you an example. Now remember, when I started off as an artist, my background is in the arts, and then I have a master's degree in architecture, and then I became a detective. And so I brought the arts with me into my work as a detective. So when I'm sharing these images with you, some of these are just sketches that I have in the book that I'm going to use in this illustration, but I think it'll help. So I wanted to show you again something that I think will help you see it in a way that maybe before you weren't able to see it. So here's our example we talked about earlier that has the 8 things in it, the 8 aspects of the universe, okay, that we say have to be explained either from inside the room or outside the room. Now, I'm not going to go all these with you right now, but I do think that the best explanation for these 8 things is outside the room, okay? Now, what's interesting about that is every time I walk into a death scene or a murder scene, I know something about my killer before I ever meet him based on the evidence in the scene. I can start to develop what is called a suspect profile. Now, the same thing can happen here. I can create a suspect profile from the evidence I find in the universe. And by the way, it's not going to end up being Mick Jagger, okay? Because Mick Jagger does not explain the evidence in the universe. Remember that each piece of evidence requires a specific kind of evidence lever. What I mean is, if we're in a universe that is, we know we're looking for something that's not spatial, it's not temporal, it's not material. It has to be purposeful and directed toward life to fine-tune a universe. That it has to be intelligent and communicative so it can actually express through DNA the instructions that we see in the genetic code. It has to be creative and resourceful so it actually can account for the design we see in biology. A conscious mind that can create freely other conscious beings in its own image that can actually act freely as well. It is the source of all moral truth and obligation. And remember, there's 2 things there, truth and obligation. And finally, it has to be the standard for good by which we define something and call it evil. This is not Mick Jagger. He doesn't fit the description. But it turns out that if all I used was science and philosophy, I have pretty much perfectly described what we know as Yahweh. And in the book, I never even use a Bible verse to do this. We just do it with science and philosophy. Now, I'm going to introduce to you a guy I arrested years ago who killed a woman in our city. And we made the case by different forms of evidence, right? We had some eyewitness accounts. We had some behaviors on his part when he was a young man. We had some physical evidence that he, from the murder weapon. And he had some statements that he made. And when you have 4 different kinds of evidence that all point to the same suspect, probably a good inference. Because you're in 4 entirely different disciplines, and they all point to the same guy. Same thing is happening here. You have 8 pieces of evidence and 4 entirely different disciplines. 2 are cosmological. The people who are involved in that are cosmologists and astrophysicists. 2 are biological. Those are microbiologists and biologists that study organisms. 2 are entirely mental. These are people who are either studying neuroscience or they are philosophers. And 2 are moral. These are really about the philosophy of morality. Now, look, it turns out that all 4 of these disciplines point to the same suspect. That's probably a good inference. Now, I want to show you what we talked about a minute ago. Let's take a look at how defense attorneys are going to attack this. They're going to say, well, there are some reasons to explain all of these other pieces of evidence. There's a bunch of these in these different categories. Like there's 4 theories to explaining the universe. There's 3 there that'll explain fine-tuning. There's 3 that'll explain the origin of life. There's 4 that'll explain the biology, design and biology. Really? Now, I'll tell you one thing for sure. None of these people agree. Okay? So I'm going to draw on here real quick. Okay? I'm going to use red to draw. So, for example, this guy here who says that this is my explanation for the origin of the universe. This guy over here says, are you crazy? You're an idiot. That doesn't work. That's why I've developed my theory. I developed my theory over here because I think you're wrong. This guy's going, you're both wrong. My theory is the better theory. He wants to toss this guy out. And by the way, this guy's theory over here that helps explain the origin of the universe has nothing to say about morality. I can't find it over here at all because it doesn't work over here. It only works for this. You see the problem? Now, why do you have so many theories on each one of these pieces of evidence? Because everyone knows they don't work. When you see a bunch of theories being offered, it's because nothing sticks to the wall. And so you can accept it this way. I'm going to clear this real quick. I think I can clear it here. Let's see. Well, maybe I can't clear it. We'll see if I made a mess of this now, Jen. There's another way to explain this. Now, one way is to say, look, maybe it's just, hundreds of different explanations that have to accidentally appear and line up perfectly to explain these 8 pieces of evidence. The second way is to say, well, is there one common causal explanation to account for everything? Well, yeah, there is. So I can either do one of 2 things. I can say, look, there's an incredibly unlikely array of unrelated causes, or there's just one unifying cause. It explains everything, and it actually describes the classic nature of God as we've always understood him. So people say all the time, they'll be looking for a theory of everything. They'll unify quantum mechanics and unify traditional historic physics. Well, I'm here to tell you there is a theory of everything. It's called God. Okay, that God theory actually explains all 8 pieces of evidence without having to go to alternative theories that don't work. So that's, I think, really where we're at. We have to help people to see that it turns out that the cleanest, simplest explanation for the entire evidence set is a cause that will actually fit the suspect profile. Oh, by the way, that is the cause we call Yahweh, because he actually is all of those things. And we don't need to go outside of that.
Let's just go back to bridge back to what we talked about last week. Let's talk about the moral argument for a minute.
Yeah.
This whole understanding that there is no objective truth, right?
Yes.
God's word, the Bible, and we'll get to, why we believe that to be the Bible. The Bible is God's word later on, but God's word says that what can be known about God has been made plain to them by the universe, by either God speaks through what has been made so that men are without excuse. But it also says that God wrote on the heart of mankind this sort of moral truth, this general moral truth.
Yes.
And if these people who say there is no moral truth, using your Roadrunner technique, they use self-defeating statements for sure. But
look at it this way. Do you know something about math? Yes. Math makes sense to you, and I can teach you math. Does this mean that you're the source of math? No. You aren't the source of the rules of math, but there's a sense in which you can look at the rules of math and you go, oh yeah, this makes sense to me. This makes sense. Addition, subtraction, all these make sense. This does not mean, though, that you're the source of those things. So let's look at it this way. The hardest claims related to truth are moral claims. It's easy to say that physical objects, we can talk about subjective and objective, right? I can't change the color of my car by just changing my opinion. The next level up are concepts, conceptual claims, like 1 + 1 = 2. Do I get to decide that by my opinion? Wouldn't that be great? We'd all get 100% on every math test. Unfortunately, those are objective claims about concepts. The third group is metaphysical claims. God exists. Jesus is the only way to God. My opinion cannot make Jesus the only way to God if he's not. And he can't keep Jesus from being the only way if he is. Both of those claims, God exists and Jesus is the only way to God, are objective claims. They may be objectively false, but they're not a matter of personal opinion. Remember, once you discover if something is objective, all that's left to discover is it true or false. The last category of claims, moral claims. Premarital sex is immoral. Okay, is this an objective claim or a subjective claim? Well, remember, there's only two choices, objective, subjective. And if it's subjective, there's two ways we could get there. One is I, as the person, get to decide if it is true or not. But that means if I say, I think it's okay to have sex with a 10-year-old. Oh, really? Well, and you say it's not, but all moral truth is decided by individuals. It's decided by persons. And if I say it's okay, then it's okay for me. You can't really judge me on this. You can't, but we're going to say, no, we don't think that's the way it works, okay? As a matter of fact, our culture we have laws. Oh, so what you're saying is the other way to get it subjectively, not a single subject, but a group of subjects who decide collectively that this is bad behavior. This is still a subjective way to get to the truth. So you might say, well, yeah, in our country, we don't think that's right. There's a law against sleeping with 10-year-olds. Well, actually, in some countries on the planet, that's not true for them. So are you saying it's okay for them? But not, because they would say, hey, it's okay over here because as a group, we decided it's okay. No, we would say that's not right, even if they decided it's okay.
Well, some would say it's not true. Right. Some would say it is absolutely right.
Well, maybe, okay, how about this? I don't want to get too bizarre in terms of doing this. Let's say you said imprisoning, executing females before the age of 10 is okay because they're trying to make sure they have more men in their culture. Can I execute females? Now, you would say, no, you can't do that. Well, we're just going to abort them. We're going to have a one-child policy. We're just going to abort all females because we don't want females. We want males mostly. At some point, you got to at least understand that if cultures, and by the way, this is what happened at Nuremberg, right? Nuremberg, after World War II, they bring all the war criminals into one tribunal. You had a USSR justice, you had an English justice, and you had an American justice. His name was Jackson, by the way. He later became a Supreme Court justice. And after World War II, they sat together trying these war criminals. And these war criminals said, you can't convict us of these war crimes. In our culture, we were rewarded for this behavior. We were promoted to our positions. The culture supported this. Whatever was happening at the camps, this is what the culture affirmed it. You can't just say because you win now and the culture shifted to you that you can now try us and execute us. And so, of course, we let them all go. No, we didn't let them all go. We executed all of them because Jackson said there's a law above the law. That's my point. Is there a law above the law? Do individuals get to decide what is morally appropriate? Well, that's not going to work. Well, then do groups? Because if groups get to decide this, if cultures get to decide whether you can, do the most reprehensible thing you can think of. And by the way, it's happening all over if you don't think this is happening now, you're not paying attention. Can I execute and crucify Christians? This is happening in places in the world. Dead Christians. This is happening, and they'll say that their abortion. This is okay because it's blasphemous for them to. So the point I'm trying to make is there are two ways to justify this. One, individuals decide that won't work. Groups of individuals decide, and even that won't work. If that was the case, two things. You better be able to be ready to bend your knee to what the larger country, because now it's just a matter of might makes right. It's a matter of if the large group decides it's morally justified, and you're in a smaller group, you better hope you're always sovereign, because the minute you lose your sovereignty, you have to bend your knee to their moral decisions because they outnumber you. And by the way, if that was the case, how does Martin Luther King Jr. ever make a case in the civil rights movement? Because at the time he made the case, I will tell you that most of the people in the culture were okay with it the way it was. And he had to stop and say, wait a minute, you can't treat us this way because there's a law above the law. I need to convince you there's a law bigger than all of your opinion that we could actually point to. There can be no moral reformers if all moral choices all moral truths simply come from the popular decision. Because that means by definition, if you hold a minority position, you are immoral, because morality is determined by the majority. See the problem with this thinking? So it turns out that even moral codes are grounded objectively. And all that's left to do then is to discover, is it true or false that premarital sex is immoral? And we can have that argument. But the claim is itself an objective claim about reality, and we have to decide if it's true or false.
Well, guys, Jim, thank you for doing this. You know, going back to the jury metaphor, you know, presenting evidence, I would, for those who are really wanting to dive down into this, there are great scientists, great studies, great information out there that verifies every one of those 8 characteristics. The anthropic principle, the principle for fine-tuning. There's secular, non-Christian scientists who've had to come to this conclusion that there is fine-tuning. These are all accepted things. And so I just encourage people to study. As we get ready to go into next week, the next study that we're going to do next week is, all right, we've decided there's a God. Jesus has claims to be God, according to Christianity. Can we trust that story? You wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity.
Right.
How do we even know this? And we're going to talk about this next week. Thanks so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks. I'm so glad to be here. We've started to build this case slowly. Is there objective truth? Does God exist? And now we'll approach the issue of Christianity next week.
All right.